Andrew Light. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress, and I direct our work on international climate policy. I'm very pleased to be able to moderate today's panel, which we are co-sponsoring with the Global Climate Network, an organization, umbrella organization of 9 think tanks around the world who cooperate on questions of climate change and promotion of a global green economy. It's actually the culmination of a private meeting we've been having over the last couple days with the members of our network as we finish up this year's work cycle and look forward to the next year of cooperation that we're going to be working on. Let me just say something about the network, and then we'll get into a short introduction of the panel, and then we'll get right down to it. The members of the network, including the Center for American Progress, is the Institute for Public Policy Research in the United Kingdom, the Bologna Foundation in Norway, TERI, the Energy and Resources Institute in India, the Climate Institute in Australia, Vita Civilis in Brazil, the Research Center for Sustainable Development at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, IMBEWU Sustainability Legal Specialists, a partnership in South Africa, and also the International Center for Energy, Environment, and Development in Nigeria. And Ewa Ellery, the director of that institute, is also here with us today. Ewa, thank you. We have just a few representatives from those, given time constraints, from those organizations up here as well. We also have other members of the organizations in the audience with us today. The topic is one that may seem painfully obvious to some of you, but perhaps not to all. And that is the question of why the world needs U.S. climate action, specifically U.S. climate policy. We're all waiting with bated breath in Washington now to see if anything can be squeezed out of the Senate in the last remaining weeks before the August recess. And if not then in the fall before the election, whether or not the U.S. Senate can join the House of Representatives in producing some kind of climate legislation that can move the ball forward. But we're not the only ones that are waiting. The rest of the world is waiting as well. And one way to think about this is that they're waiting on a promissory note not from President Obama, but from presidential candidate Obama, who, when he went to Berlin on July 24th of 2008, said the following: "This is the moment when we must come together to save this planet. Let us resolve that we will not leave our children a world where the oceans rise and famines spread and terrible storms devastate our lands. Let us resolve that all nations, including my own, will act with the same seriousness of purpose as has your nation and reduce the carbon we send into our atmosphere. This is the moment to give our children back their future," which are extremely powerful and compelling words, which of course we'd come to represent by Barack Obama the summer before the November election. And now we want to know whether or not that promise will be fulfilled. The stakes on this are incredibly high. Obviously the U.S. was behind for 8 years. The Bush administration, I would say, longer than that, with respect to serious international participation that started in 1992 with the Earth Summit to try to come together as a global community and solve a global problem. And it was with much fanfare, obviously, that we elected a president who was serious about doing something about this problem and indeed made the promise that I just mentioned to the rest of the world. The stakes, I think, are familiar to many. I will just briefly review some of them before turning it over to our panelists. But according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Fourth Assessment Report, the global goal that we need to get to by 2050 to have any hope at holding humanly caused temperature increase by the end of the century to 2 degrees Celsius is to cut global emissions in half. The minimum amount that developed countries such as the United States have to contribute to this is a reduction of 80% of our emissions by 2050. But even if we were to cut our emissions 100% by 2050, we still would not get to the global goal of a global reduction. Even if the developed countries cut by 100%, we still wouldn't get to the global goal of cutting global emissions in half by 50% unless we have the cooperation of the developing countries in the world, especially, and in particular, the major emerging economies, such as 3 of those represented on the panel today: China, India, and South Africa. Now, the deal that was struck to finally get some kind of cooperation moving forward together among all of these parties was struck in 2007 at the UN Climate Summit in Bali. And there it was agreed that though the details were to be left filled in, in exchange for assistance with financing and technology transfer, developing countries would begin joining developed countries in terms of a transition to a low-carbon or a no-carbon economy, a regime of sustainable development, so that they could join us in making this global reduction. Again, in exchange for assistance with technology and financing. The House-passed climate bill of last summer would have fulfilled that promise. And as we move towards the Copenhagen summit this past December, the understanding is that the initial down payment for the amount of money needed to get the world moving in the right direction would be the establishment of a global quick start financing fund by 2012 of $30 billion, accelerating and increasing, as Hillary Clinton promised in advance of the Copenhagen summit, that the U.S. would participate in a global fund of $100 billion annually by 2020. Now, clearly, the Senate does not yet have a package together to get us there. We've seen other actions move forward with respect to the president starting the process of defining carbon as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And so he now has authority to move forward. We also have many state action on climate change. And I would say that today, even if we don't get a Senate bill, on the worst case scenario, we don't see action from the Congress, we can probably at least make fulfill the president's promise at Copenhagen that initial U.S. cuts in carbon emissions would be 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. And I think that we will continue to make good on our promise to contribute to that quick start financing by 2012. The U.S. Committed $1.4 billion in 2010. The appropriations request for 2011 for climate assistance is $1.9 billion. And I think we will continue with that through to 2012. But what we don't have, even under the best case scenario right now, if the Senate passed the bill that they're discussing today, right now in caucus with the Senate leadership, is a bill that actually has a mechanism that can do what the House bill did and generate the financing long-term by 2020 to get us the dollars that we need to get the world moving in the same direction. And the other thing that we don't have, of course, if the U.S. doesn't move forward in aggressive fashion, is the largest energy market in the world, the second largest emitter in the world, becoming a repository and an attractor for the clean energy innovation and the clean energy investment that will be done globally. And we stand not only to drag down the process of continuing in that progress, which indeed is going on in the rest of the world right now, developed and developing countries, but also we will not be a competitor in that race at all. And in fact, we will lose out as the rest of the world moves forward. So I think those are the stakes that we see before us today. Again, as we wait for the Democratic caucus in the Senate to finish and we see where we're going to be by the end of this week. Now, to discuss these topics and others, we have, as I said before, 4 distinguished panelists. I'll introduce them in the order that I'll call on them. First, Professor Pan Jiahua, who is Executive Director of the Research Center for Sustainable Development in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He previously worked with the United Nations Development Program Beijing office as a Senior Program Officer and Advisor on Environment and Development, and for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 3 on Mitigation. He was also a lead author and therefore shares in the Nobel Peace Prize with the other lead authors of the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report on Sustainable Development and Mitigation. So thank you very much for joining us, Professor Pan. Secondly, Dr. Arabinda Mishra, who's sitting to his left, Director of the Climate Change Division of the Energy and Resource Institute in India. He also holds the position concurrently of Dean of the Faculty of Policy and Planning at the Terry University. He was a fellow for 4 years in the Center for Multidisciplinary Development Research in Karnataka, and before that taught for over 10 years at the graduate and undergraduate level in different government colleges of Orissa. He was also the project leader of the Ecosystem Services and Poverty Alleviation Study in South Asia, investigating the links between ecosystems and poverty in South Asia to identify ways in which the poor are dependent on the services provided by ecosystems in the region. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Mishra. Next, immediately to my left, Marie Parramon, who is Sustainability Legal Consultant at IMBEWU Sustainability Legal Specialists in South Africa. She is a lawyer by training with expertise in national as well as international environmental law and management, including in the areas of climate change, EIA, waste management, marine and coastal law, environmental risk assessment, and environmental liability. Between 2005 and 2007, she worked for Transnet National Ports Authority in South Africa, where she provided assistance with environmental risks and liabilities assessments of the port's operation and development. And finally, last but certainly not least, our colleague who is the GCN Secretariat in London, Andrew Pendleton, who's a senior research fellow on the Global Change team at the Institute for Public Policy Research. Prior to joining IPPR, he led climate change work with Christian Aid, the United Kingdom's Churches Development Agency, and prior to that was a Sony Award-winning broadcast journalist with the BBC, also contributing work to The Guardian, The Independent, Church Times, Channel 4 News, BBC, various BBC programs, CNN, and Sky News. So thank you very much indeed, Andrew, for joining us. So Professor Pan, we'll start with you. Some short comments each speaker will make, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Should be good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's very much an honor to talk something about the climate actions together, the Chinese, the Americans, and the world together. I think that there are many, the Chinese must learn from the Americans, and in the meantime, probably there are something the Americans can learn from the Chinese. And climate change mitigation is one of these, areas. China has been so determined and so ambitious in fighting climate change. And if you look at, the Chinese targets for carbon intensity reduction, the highest, among the world. It is intensity, but if you look at, in 15 years, 40 to 45% reduction of per unit of GDP. No any other country in the world has achieved such a high rate. And also, China has been very aggressively investing in the development of renewable energy and the increase in energy efficiency. For the 11th five-year plan, in 4 years only, we have shut down some 60 gigawatts of small-scaled, less efficient power plants in order to increase energy efficiency and to reduce carbon emissions. And China would like to do more, but there are constraints. For one thing, China is at such a stage of urbanization and industrialization. We need increase in energy consumption to power the process of industrialization and urbanization. Give you one example. Each year, if the rate of urbanization is 1 percentage point, that would be something, 13 million people added to the urban sector, the housing, urban infrastructure, and jobs, the enormous amount of energy requirements for these people to be in the urban sector. And also, China faces a dilemma as well. We want to go low carbon, but we have to go to be higher carbon for low carbon. The reason is very simple. For instance, if you want to subsidize renewable energy, we subsidize electrical vehicle, and then the money has to be from somewhere, from where. That is the fossil fuel energy resources. Give you one example. If China would like to develop electrical vehicle, and then if we have a levy on each vehicle for some 1,000 RMB yuan, and then if China has an automobile fleet of 1 million, that would be only 1 billion RMB yuan. The amount would be somewhat negligible. And then if the Chinese automobile fleet would increase to 100 million, and then the amount would be something more than enough to subsidize the development of electrical vehicle. So this is something, if you want to go low carbon, you have to go higher carbon. Otherwise, the process would be very, very slow. So we have to, strike for a balance. And then, still, China looks at the Americans. If you do a little bit more, this would be an encouragement for the Chinese to do a little bit more. If you can do much better, and then that would give the Chinese and the world some confidence that we should do more and we should be able to have a higher quality of living without high emissions of carbon dioxide. So I think that this is very important. Look, Andrew has just suggested that by 2050, the Americans would reduce their per capita emissions by 80%. And 80% then, because currently is somewhat 20 tons per capita if you reduce 80%, and then by 2050, average American would still have 4 tons of carbon dioxide emissions, and that's the current world average. And then this, would be a very bad signal for the outside world that, even by 2050, the Americans would still require 4 tons of carbon dioxide. This currently, the Chinese #1 emitter in terms of per capita terms, only 4 tons of emissions. So I think that the Americans should and can do more and demonstrate to the outside world that the Americans is the leader and is pushing the process of decarbonization, and then the world would certainly follow, and then we can work together for reaching the 2-degree temperature increase limit. Well, thank you.
Professor Pan. Dr. Mishra.
Very good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for your interest and also coming here to listen to our views. Let me start by giving you a picture of what is happening back in India, a very positive atmosphere where we find a lot of action taking place on issues related to both mitigation and adaptation. And as I was mentioning to my colleagues, a day before when I arrived, it was full of optimism, but one day of stay in the states and listening to some views from participants in a small interaction yesterday, it's now optimism laced with some degree of caution. So it's really unfortunate because when we look at the Indian scene and see the kind of actions that are being taken by the central government as well as at the level of the state governments, it is perhaps a bit frustrating and also a bit difficult for us to understand as to why we have so much of difficulty in having a strong legislation happening domestically in the United States. The economics is very clear, and the business opportunities have been highlighted in many studies as to how the United States can gain by having a strong domestic legislation. So I'm not going into that front, and but I would like to draw your attention to the kind of a crisis of confidence that is likely to emerge if America doesn't act strongly. After Copenhagen, whatever may be the shortcomings of the outcome that we have in the form of the Copenhagen Accord, it did display a very high degree of agreement at a high level of political leadership as to the urgency of the action that is required and as to the direction in which action should be taken. The importance of finance and technology came out strongly. And at least over a range of issues, there was a convergence of, there was a pretty fair degree of agreement. Now, from Copenhagen to this point, there is a sense that we are losing time without accomplishing anything on the international front. And when the policymakers at the domestic level within countries like India see the kind of lack of progress that is there at the international level, vis-a-vis the kind of political capital that has been spent in coming up with ambitious policies, ambitious programs, then it's likely that the lack of action at the international level has a real danger of affecting domestic action, domestic political will to act on this vital challenge. Now, in India, as most of you would be knowing, we have a national action plan on climate change that has set out clearly the priority areas in which mitigation and adaptation actions need to be taken. And these priority areas have been spelled out in the form of 8 national missions. And most of the institutional arrangements in terms of identifying the nodal ministries, in terms of identifying the time frames, and in terms of identifying the broad policy parameters, they have been spelled out for these 8 national missions. Just to kind of give you the information, the national missions relate to enhanced energy efficiency. There is a national mission on solar energy. There is a national mission on sustainable agriculture. There is a mission on green India, on urban habitats, on sustainable habitats. There is a national mission on water and a mission on strategic knowledge. And taken together, they sort of give you the impression as to the country's thinking on where action should be concentrated to protect domestic interests when it comes to dealing with climate change risks. Now, of these 8 missions where we have found concrete action plans being drawn out are the 2 missions that are very focused on mitigation strategies, the mission on enhanced energy efficiency and the mission on solar power. And it is really amazing when one looks at the policy documents as to the kind of ambition that is spelled out in terms of targets, in terms of the capacity buildup that is envisaged, and it is all involving a lot of financial resources mobilization and a lot of technological development as well as deployment within the country. So ultimately, if these aspirations, if these ambitions that are being spelled out in India are going to play out their full course of action with effective outcomes, it requires the international community to also be part of the effort as far as mobilization of financial resources goes, as far as capacity creation goes, and as far as technological development and deployment goes. So it's very hard to think of domestic action staying or being independent of international cooperation. So it's very important to understand this because there is a feeling in the negotiations that the UN process has to go on irrespective of whether the United States joins in or not, because basically the world cannot wait. The time window is getting shorter and shorter, and most of the developing countries are putting in that kind of political capital to see to it that the UN process comes out strongly in terms of an outcome in the very near future. So given that kind of a scenario, it's important that the United States contributes to enhancing the confidence in these processes, and also contributing in terms of the intellectual capital that it can bring into technology development, and the kind of support that it can bring to the process in mobilizing financial resources. So it is in that sense the need to maintain and scale up confidence in these international processes, the need to have the world believe that the international community can come together to deal with a global crisis such as a climate change. It is in that context that I feel a strong domestic legislation is extremely important. Apart from the economic opportunities that such technology development may likely to create, the kind of markets that the American companies can exploit in countries like China and India, the kind of international collaborations that can contribute to ever expanding R&D opportunities, ever expanding intellectual capital. So apart from these, it is more from a sense of morality, a sense of maintaining credibility in its own systems, in its own commitments to the international community, that I feel the United States has to come up with a strong domestic legislation. That may seem a bit provocative, but I feel that it is important that we see the need in this kind of a light at this present juncture. Thank you.
Thank you. And just want to say one thing, Arabinda. I mean, I think that it is a good provocative comment, which I encourage, but also is in line with the President Obama's speech in Berlin, right? I mean, he clearly contextualized this with respect to the moral obligation we have to future generations, future Americans, future Indians, future Chinese, everyone, all future people of the world. This is the moment. We are the generation that gets to make the decision about how we will move forward, and he contextualized it in these strong moral terms. Marie.
It's quite difficult to add to what has been done, but I think I would like to speak from African context more than from South Africa, because South Africa is a very difficult country in the African context. But we always reminding when we work with the African negotiator of their own reality, and it's the fact that it's not about mitigation for them, it's about adaptation, and it's about if all the bigger emitters are not acting now, they won't have a choice. They don't have the luxury to look at options, to look at financing. Climate change is going to impact them the most. Africa is the most vulnerable continent to climate change effect. And each time we are reminding that if the biggest players don't all come together, we are going to be impacted in a way that no one else almost in the world will be. And at this stage, looking at the state or at China or all the big emitters and saying, we're waiting on you, because there is nothing that we can do. We can't mitigate. We can't do anything else. So it's very difficult when we engage from a South African perspective, because we look at the mitigation and adaptation side of the debate. But each time they remind us, do what you can, but you need to mitigate. So that's the first point from an international perspective. Also from the African context, I think we see that the US need to move forward to kind of crystallize some of the two main aspects on the international negotiation level. The first one being a carbon market, and just make a decision around that and create clarity for all the developing country actors, either in the CDM or carbon reduction field. Because at the moment, we're losing a bit of hope, and the unclarity impacts the development of carbon reduction projects in Africa. The second one is finance, obviously, and at the moment, due to the unclarity again around the US position, it's giving a lot of excuse to everyone else. So we're sitting in Africa saying, well, if the US makes that move, then no one else will have the other excuse or more excuse to say, well, we're going to wait. And so I think if you make that move, even if it's not the full one that we're expecting, you will get the momentum to everyone else and to move forward at the same space that we need. At a national level, it's been very interesting to be in South Africa over the last 2 years, because we have been playing that kind of connector. Well, we feel that we've been playing that kind of connector role between developing and developing country, because we get the mitigation and adaptation, I will say, debate internally. And for the last 2 years, we've been making very strong statements as, like China, like India, like Brazil, we're going to take mitigation action, and we're ready to take a step forward, even if we're only a developing country, even if it's going to change maybe our development trajectory, but we are ready to do it, and we have to do it in terms of the overall goal of sustainable development. either for the last 2 years we've been able to convince our private sector that it is a right choice and it is a right direction from a competitiveness perspective. And after Copenhagen, the private sector look at government and say, are you sure we're making the right move? Because the US is still not doing that move and we're doing it, and we don't have a lot of luxury from an economic perspective to go and be the first starter from a developing country perspective, because we don't have a lot of flexibility. So at the moment, what we're seeing at a national level, because there is such uncertainty, we think that our own government is now getting scared of taking the necessary measure and policy. And we are supposed to get a green paper, which is our policy paper on climate change, a policy paper on green economy, and a strategy paper on the use of market-based instrument for climate change, looking at carbon tax and carbon inventory. Our government has already said that we will have a carbon tax in South Africa. And we're just preparing the scope and the kind of approach to the carbon tax in the country. But at the moment, I think people are a bit confused because it is not so clear at a global level. And then the other aspect is trade. And a lot of our private sector is, well, if the state is not moving forward and we're starting to have various evolution in various countries, the EU, the state, China, how is it going to impact us from a trade perspective? And now it's not only national, we need to start looking at how everyone is going to move and not moving at the same kind of speed, and it makes it even more difficult to develop our own developing country. So it's very difficult, a lot of uncertainty, and I think just by having you on board in a much more clear position will just create a bigger momentum at the international and national level of all the countries sitting here, I think.
Andrew, thank you. I was thinking, listening to your quotation from now President Obama's Berlin speech, and thinking of something else that he said in his inauguration, which was, and I paraphrase, I don't have the direct quotation, but he spoke about approaching the world with an open hand rather than a clenched fist. And I think the first of three things that I want to say is that this debate is really all about the open hand. Now, I think when Obama went to Copenhagen, he went with the open hand, and I think delivered something among a group of other political leaders which was absolutely critical, which was a political understanding on climate change, the first time a group of leaders at that level had got together and made those kind of statements. So whatever the Copenhagen Accord lacks in terms of concrete proposals, I think in terms of political will and commitment, it was critical. And Obama's role in that cannot be underestimated. Without him, it would have been very difficult to pull that together. But the open hand has to be demonstrated. And I think the demonstration of that has to happen at the domestic level as much as it has to happen. So to build confidence and trust going forward at the international level, all of the major economies have to demonstrate that they're willing to have the open hand at home as well as abroad. And I think we've heard from my colleagues on the panel about the really inspiring things that are actually happening in a concrete way around the world. And just in case you missed it, Professor Pan actually did, yes, say they've closed 60 gigawatts of inefficient coal power in the past 4 years. That's the entire UK energy system, electricity generation system, closed down in 4 years. So that's no small move. The second thing I want to talk about is that so while we need to get domestic action right, it's an international problem. We can't get away from the fact that this, however hard we try, we can't get away from the fact that in the end we have to approach this problem as an international one. Because we live and breathe the same atmosphere, and if we're eroding that atmosphere, however intangible that is, however uncertain some aspects of the science are, it's clear that that's happening, and we don't actually have a choice but to act on that internationally in the end. I don't think that's going to happen immediately. I think it'll take us a few more years to come back now to the table and take more progressive action, which means that it's even more important that we get things going at the domestic level. So that's number two, the international aspect of the problem. Number three is the perspective from Europe. Now, Europe emerged from Copenhagen probably the worst, actually, of many countries and regions, because we had high hopes and they weren't met in terms of some of the numbers and the figures we wanted. So we came back a little bruised, and And like many wounded animals, we licked our wounds and thought about what we were going to do next. And I think now what you're seeing in recent newspaper articles that have been published in the UK and in Germany and in France is the emergence of a new climate diplomacy from Europe. And it's not a climate diplomacy that's based on morality or on leadership. It's a climate diplomacy based on ruthless self-interest. So what you're seeing from the UK and from the French and from the German environment and climate change and energy ministers is a collaboration around the idea that moving up to this higher target of 30% that we talked about but didn't in the end get the opportunity to do at Copenhagen, moving up to that 30% as being in our own interest. So we face some upfront costs. Yes, it's going to cost us money to do, but actually that restructuring in our economy is going to be really, really important to drive Europe forward into a new competitive arena. Every big wave of economic growth, both nationally, regionally, globally, in the past has been based on technology. Climate-friendly technology is going to be the next wave of economic growth. That's the belief in Europe. And so we're embracing this for our own self-interest. And just as a reminder, we have a huge list of climate policy now in Europe. We've got the European Emissions Trading Scheme. We've got a package that's agreed by all member states to cut emissions by 20%, maybe 30%, to increase our share of renewable energy across the Union to 20% by 2020, to increase our energy efficiency by 20% by 2010. Each member state has its own policies. In the UK, we have tax incentives. We have the renewable obligation, a subsidy paid to energy producers that install renewable energy. We're collaborating on technology development, carbon capture and storage. Now, if I was sitting where you're sitting and I was looking at Europe coming out of the Copenhagen summit, licking its wounds and rethinking its climate policy, and listening to what you've heard from Professor Pan and from Arabinda and from Marie, I would be maybe thinking, if we don't do this for climate reasons, then maybe we should think of some other reasons to do this, because this is going to be the inevitable trajectory of the development of the world. Can we do it quickly enough to stop dangerous climate change? I don't know, and I think that's where the international level comes in, where we lock some of these things in terms of a legal treaty in the future. But this is where things are going. So to quote another US president, you may be either with us or against us, but it's absolutely critical, I think, for the economic future of the US that you are. That's the European perspective. I hope it has some traction here.
Thank you. So for questions in just a couple of minutes, I want to pick up on just the last comment that Andrew said and sort of put that into sort of broader perspective. I mean, the analysis that we did here at the Center for American Progress and that was done by other modeling groups on different parts of the world was that if you add up all the commitments that were made after Copenhagen, so we got this political agreement out of Copenhagen as a down payment, as it was set up. It was supposed to be step one, political agreement at Copenhagen, and then we'll try to get the legally binding agreement at some date later. If not, at the next UN summit in Cancun, likely not there, it's coming up this coming December, maybe South Africa the year following. But that if you add up all the commitments that people made under the assumption of what are your national action plans to, contributing to holding temperature increase at 2 degrees C. That was basically the grand premise of Copenhagen. Now everyone tell us what you're going to do. All the major emitters, in fact, over 110 countries actually put forward, said they embraced the Copenhagen Accord. There were more than 40 actual action plans on decreasing emissions. And you add all that together, and without going into the details of the numbers, it looks like if everyone did what they say they're going to do, that's essentially 2/3 of where we need to be to hold temperature increase at 2 degrees C by the end of the century. Now, given that this is not in the context of a legally binding agreement yet, these national action plans really are expressions largely of self-interest. At least that's the way that I read them. I mean, they're largely plans that countries were going to do anyway because we sort of see that it's in the interests of China. We talk in this country, we don't like talking about the impacts of climate when we talk about our climate change legislation, or indeed using the C word at all when we talk about our legislation. We talk about jobs, and we talk about energy security. But of course, those are messages that resonate as well in other parts of the world as well, and not just as convenient political framings, not just as rhetorical devices, but as actual policies that can get jobs and can help people to rely only on the renewable resources that in the long run will be better for many reasons for them. So if self-interest does play a role in at least getting us started, do you all think it's enough to get us where we need to go? I mean, could we talk about sort of the mechanisms for closing that gap? How do you squeeze out the rest of the 1/3 of those emissions that are needed? And why is international cooperation so important for getting us there? Anyone?
Well, the current pledges are certainly insufficient for securing the 2-degree target, and this is simply because the developed countries are unable to have their 2020 year targets sufficiently reduced. This, gives a very bad message to the developing world that it's not easy to get emissions cut because, the developing countries would have some inconvenience to do a little bit more. But I do agree, and we all agree that, for reduction of carbon emissions is for self-interest, is for energy security. And for China, this is particularly the case, simply because China is very poor in oil reserve. We have to import last year over 200 million tons of crude oil, and that is not sufficient. And currently, the automobile ownership is something only 50 per 1,000 people. There's only 1/10 of the European level. Europeans, every 2 people you got 1. There's only 1/15 of the American, ownership level. And then if the Chinese would like to have more automobile ownership, and currently we have no oil anymore, and then we do need to think about, because the current proven reserve of oil inside China is only sufficient for the current consumption for 11.3 years, and then we can import, and then the world is something 40 years, and then you may say that the reserves can be found more and more, but we have to agree that the planet Earth is physically limited. The limit we are approaching. Currently, we cannot, in our imagination, we have the technologies to enlarge the surface of our planet Earth. So we have to, because otherwise, 30 years is not that long. 50 years, not that long at all. So we have to think about, where in advance, we have to take actions. So the problem is not that we should make the transformation to a low carbon economy. The problem is how fast we can move towards a low and even zero carbon economy.
Arabinda, I want to ask you about picking up on some of that, because the numbers, the big numbers that we throw out in the international, the 50% cuts, the sort of the how many, how much in terms of reductions we expect from developed countries, how much from developing countries. These are numbers, and obviously they don't really mean anything unless you've actually got not only the national level policies, but the actual projects on the ground there. And those projects on the ground are often, that's not really something you work out at the UN level. It's often obviously it's coming from the ground up. It's also accelerated by bilateral relationships. And I think that is one of the biggest kind of ironies of all this, is that while we seem to be stalling out in the US on domestic legislation, and that will have an impact on the international negotiations, still the US is pursuing very ambitious bilateral agreements with India, with China, with other countries around the world, which are about the kind of the cooperation that gets things off the ground. And when I was in India, I was just returned from India. I was there for 10 days on a State Department trip going through Calcutta, Mumbai, and Delhi. Most people didn't want to talk to me about the international negotiations. Most of them wanted to talk to me about their really interesting project, right, on the ground, which actually is trying to get solar lanterns distributed, as your organization has worked very, very hard on in these different sort of cooperation schemes to build the interest there at the local level. Could you talk about sort of some of those and the role that cooperation, international cooperation plays to make those actual projects that are getting the meaningful reductions, off the ground?
I think you're absolutely right. A bottom-up approach kind of complements the whatever targets that we have, the big numbers that we have at the international level, because they give us a certain proof of concept, as to say that cooperation in critical areas can work. We do have win-win solutions. So moving from the textbook, moving from the idea stage, or the lab stage to the field stage is extremely important when we talk about technology development and deployment. Now, why a lot of people are getting excited about these projects in the ground is because the results are extremely tangible. They are there to see, and they also are kind of relevant to the specific national circumstances. So when we're talking about big targets or the big numbers, they don't convey that sense of purpose, the kind of opportunities that may be there to make that kind of a difference, to make that kind of a transition. To the extent the bilateral mechanisms can come up with these kind of projects, they are certainly welcome, and they certainly make a difference in meeting some of the development needs, I would say. And in many cases, these projects have mitigation as a co-benefit. The acceptability of these projects is high because they are primarily targeted at a particular development challenge. So when you're talking about solar lanterns, for example, the kind of a program that Terry has, the Lighting a Billion Lives, it specifically addresses a challenge that nearly 4 billion households face in rural areas of India. So it's a critical need, and when you have a specific technology, a specific product addressing that kind of a need in cooperation with international partners, then you get the confidence that you have the technology, the cooperation can work, and it has a potential to be replicated, to be scaled up, and contribute in so many ways, not only to the mitigation need, but also to the development need. But saying so, as Professor Pan said, when we are talking about the speed of action, the kind of action that is required to address the concentration that is fast building up in the atmosphere, we do need these targets, and we do need these commitments backed up by a very strong compliance mechanism. So it's all about it's not only the commitments for their sake. I also go back to your earlier question about being motivated by self-interest. It is important to ensure that places don't remain as good intent only. It is important to ensure that places are acted on, and we do have a effective mechanism to ensure that countries are acting on their commitments. So my personal opinion is that both bilateral cooperation and the multilateral cooperation both are required, and to bring about a change in the kind of a time frame that we have to meet the desired objectives.
Good.
And maybe I can add also that most of the discussion has been on mitigation, but on adaptation, which is of interest to many developing countries, and particularly in countries where climate risks are basically an issue of survival of countries, of communities themselves. That is where also countries can come together. There is a strong scope for international cooperation, and to address the trust deficit that is being discussed today in the area of international cooperation. So that's where also bilateral cooperation can play a critical role in building confidence, in also having action happening on the ground.
And we're not talking about obligations to future generations, but
Yes.
obviously the people.
Yes, these are the present generation
that are feeling these impacts right now.
Yes.
Right now. I must say, just having been in Calcutta, the idea of millions of Bangladeshi climate refugees spilling into Calcutta was unthinkable.
Yes.
Actually, after seeing.
And there are some dimensions we have still not, considered. The whole issue of conflict over scarce resources. What kind of impact you have of migration at a regional level, but they may have security implications at an international level. People have not really explored these issues, and that is again where one sees clearly the need for the global community to get together, have that kind of a foresight to deal with this in a very effective manner.
Thank you. Well, I think that was a very good start, and so we've got over half an hour now for questions. So we'll start, we'll start first with any members of the press that have a question. Any members of the media? As is our custom here.
Sorry. Yeah, hi. My name is Bill Murray. I'm with Energy Intelligence Group. I was interested in a statement Andrew was making near the end about moving towards self-interest in Europe. But you were talking about moving, in my mind, you kind of buried the lead a bit in talking about moving from a policy based on climate to policies much more closer to an industry policy, to an industrial policy. And it makes me wonder if certain elements in the last 10 years haven't been misplayed in terms of climate and the moral obligations and the arguments that maybe haven't been able to be made that now can be made with a much broader European-wide, regional-wide industrial policy. Is that you're making? Do
you want me to take that straight away? Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question. So what I think, and this is not necessarily a European political view, because I'm not sure Europe would want to be, well, some countries in Europe would probably quite like the idea of having an industrial policy. Others, like the UK, would probably not want to be seen to have an industrial policy. But we do have. It's very clear that the governments of Europe, including the UK, which is probably in terms of economic ideology much closer to the US than some of its European neighbours, is quite clear on intervening. And this is not a left-wing government, it's a centre-right government, quite clear that it will intervene in the economy to stimulate the areas of the economy that are, yes, going to be good for climate change, but I think it is basically just because we need to build manufacturing capacity, which we've lost, and we can do that through the development of new clean industries. Because we have a massive finance sector in the UK which has taken a blow in the finance crisis, but actually can sell its services to the rest of the world around new green industries, and particularly carbon markets, which is a big one for the UK. And also, I think, all the other services that it's required to put very big projects of the kind that are going to happen for climate change mitigation together. So not just hard manufacturing, but being, the project managers, if you like, legal services, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those things, I think, are in our reckoning, and we see that we're going to take a progressive industrial policy, if you want to call it that. My position is that if people want to do things that are good for climate change for other reasons, that's absolutely fine. And I think it's a really important thing that they do, so that we're not always asking people all of the time to believe 100% of the science of climate change in order to do some of the things that need to happen, because we do need to do this for energy security. I was in India as well a couple of months ago, and the staggering computations that you need to do in order to supply the Indian population with the kind of levels of electricity generation that access to electricity that we enjoy in the UK are just not possible via fossil fuels. It's just not possible to do. India hasn't got huge coal reserves, et cetera, et cetera. So they have to go down the clean energy route. So if that's the case, then that's great, and we should encourage India to go down that route as far as possible, because the more we expand markets, the cheaper technologies will be. So I don't think we should always insist that people do things for climate reasons, but I also don't think we should lose that argument, because in the end, as Andrew says, self-interest can take us probably further than we think at the moment, and other interests can probably take us further than we think. But to get that extra mile that we're probably going to have to go, I think we probably will need to do some things because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think just to add one thing very quickly to that, I mean, I think in the U.S., like we crossed that Rubicon long ago. We sort of abandoned talking about climate among the campaigning to produce a climate and energy bill. We talked about energy security and national security and jobs as really kind of the main motivators. And I think that unfortunately, it sort of, that puts us in this weird position of people sort of thinking, oh, well, if we lose the Senate bill, we're losing all these job opportunities. But of course, we're losing a lot more than job opportunities if we lose this legislation. And that's not entirely, I think the gravity of that is what's not being recognized at the moment among the people who are trying to decide how we're going to get to an end game. And that worries me a great deal. We had a question here? And then one in the back, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I am Sun Guoshun from the Chinese Embassy. I am in charge of environmental and climate change issues in the embassy. So it is very appreciated that CAP holds this kind of seminar. I think it is very important for the U.S. to take action, and the world is looking forward to the U.S. to take actions. I would like to make a comment on what you have said in your introduction. You said that even if the developed countries cut their emissions by 80% by 2050, or even 100% by 2050, the developing world needs to do something. I think, this statement gives an impression that the action of developed countries is conditioned on the action of developing countries. I think this is not right. I would say that if developed countries cut their emissions to 100%, I can assure you that developing countries will follow suit. Taking U.S. as an example, if the U.S. is determined to cut its per capita emission to 10 tons CO2, I am sure the whole world will follow suit. I can assure you. I think there should be an urgency for the U.S. to take actions. If everybody in the world emits more than 20 tons per capita, the world will be would have been destroyed already. So I think it's very important and urgent for the U.S. to take actions. And my question to you is whether the Senate will act upon the energy and the climate bill this year. Will there be any opportunity for this bill to pass this year? Thank you.
Well, my boss, John Podesta, at the Clean Energy Ministerial meeting that Secretary Chu organized at the beginning of this week on Monday and Tuesday, refused to actually lay odds on the Senate bill. And so I'm just going to punt to him and say, yeah, if John won't lay odds, then I'm certainly not going to lay odds on that. But is there a chance? Yes, of course there's a chance. And I think that we're going to see there are many different sort of scenarios under which they can get a bill done. If not before the August recess, then in September. If not September, then in the lame duck session between the elections in November and the transition to the next Congress in January. And there's ideas of sort of staggering out, rolling out different bills. I think as of today, that's the current plan. Maybe an oil bill this week. Maybe we try to do a stronger energy bill and a cap on the electricity sector in September, and then maybe strengthen it. So there's lots of scenarios, and we really aren't going to know what's going to happen until the end of this. And other than that, I guess I would just sort of say, if I left you the impression that I thought that the U.S. should act or developed countries should act only if developing countries act, then that's not what I intended to say whatsoever. In fact, I don't think we can look at this as a conditional, I will do this if you do that, although I think that's effectively kind of where we're winding up right now. I think one of the most interesting things that happened in the summer with respect to new data we have on the balance of contributions by developed and developing countries was when the Environmental Protection Agency released its analysis of the Kerry-Lieberman Senate climate bill. And they ran a bunch of different scenarios, and Richard Caperton here at the Center for American Progress and I wrote an article about this. But they ran a bunch of different scenarios. What happens if just the if everyone acts but except the United States? What happens if only the United States were to act, which is kind of impossible because that would mean everyone stopping what they're doing now, which I don't think is likely. But a very interesting scenario they ran, which is what happens if the U.S. and the other G8 countries who committed a little over a year ago in Italy at the G8 summit in L'Aquila, that they were committed to the goal of cutting their emissions 80% by 2050. What if they fulfilled that pledge and then developing countries continued to emit on a business as usual pathway? And by developing countries, we don't mean Kenya, right, and Grenada and Cuba, right? We're talking about the major emitters in the developing world. Those are the major emitters in the world get to decide the future of the planet, not the very, very small emitters. So if the major emitters in the developing world chose to continue emitting and did not stop until 2050 and then began a reduction, then the calculation the Environmental Protection Agency has under that scenario is we still have a 50-50 chance of stabilizing temperature increase at 2 degrees Celsius. Now, I don't like those odds. I don't like a coin toss on my children's future, or a viable future for them. But nonetheless, I think it does demonstrate clearly, and I think for other reasons clearly, why developed countries need to sort of make the ambitious cuts that they're going to make. And we still cannot close the gap unless we get cooperation from the major emitters in the developing world. And I think I'm not making it conditional, but those are just the physical facts of the matter. Unless we get to some common solution, whether it's per capita or some other way of gaming out a solution, we do not succeed. I had one in the back first, and then we'll start back in the front.
Hi, I'm Scott Wilson from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. You mentioned the EPA. One kind of trajectory that's looking more and more probable is that the EPA is going to end up regulating CO2 in an effective and meaningful way. In the absence of legislation from Congress, would China and India view EPA regulation of CO2 as kind of an effective step, and then would they be willing to say, oh, okay, well, the Americans are finally doing something, so now we can start, acting along with them?
Or continue acting, I would say. Yeah.
Well, China's actions are unconditional. We've been doing more than the Americans. And if the Americans, the Congress would have the bill passed, that would be a minor step forward, better than doing nothing. But that is certainly insufficient. If the Americans are unable to make substantial cuts, and then the world would really have a huge lack of confidence in doing more.
Arabinda, do you want to talk about if we end up doing this not through legislation but through direct action from the Environmental Protection Agency? Does that matter from the Indian perspective?
Well, it does send a positive signal, and like China, India is committed to a certain action. So it is not again whether US does this or that. Some of the policy principles are already in place, and the policy architecture is taking its shape, irrespective of what is happening in the United States. But what would happen is the kind of impact that a strong legislation would have on these two magic words, finance and technology. Yeah. And the kind of impulse that it would provide to whatever actions are happening in not only India but also in other major developing countries, because unless you have that kind of a strong legislation which sends the right kind of, or which sets the right kind of incentives for the other players to get motivated to invest money on technology development, to invest money on investment to invest money on clean energy, on other mitigation strategies, then to that extent, the ambitions in developing countries that are taking actions would be constrained. And interestingly, the National Solar Mission, India's National Solar Mission recognizes this in terms of the capacity addition that would happen if there is global deployment of technology because of strong legislation, not in the United States, but because of action happening in the developed countries. And it is a kind of a doubling of capacity that we are seeing if there is strong action from United States, particularly because of the kind of impulse that it will give to the private sector, to the technological entrepreneurs, and to the finance sector, for example, to the venture capitalists. So in terms of mobilizing finance, in terms of developing technology, giving the right signals for the deployment of technology, in creating that momentum for international collaborations in the corporate sector, where most of the action would happen actually, I think a legislation is far preferable to executive action.
I think Arabinda is absolutely right, and obviously it's not up to a foreigner to come and tell you how to do it. It's up to you to resolve that yourselves. But I mean, I think that what strikes me as being the big difference between the two different approaches, which may, you may be able to convince an external, an international audience that, in terms of fulfilling what you said you'd do in the Copenhagen Accord, either is fine. And as I say, that's up to you. But one is kind of negative in the sense that it's kind of fighting a rearguard action. One is positive, and because your bill has so much more in it than just carbon limitation. And that's why I think, because the absolutely critical thing, if we're serious about clean technology markets, is to grow the size of the markets quite fast, because that will reduce the cost, because it will increase the pace of innovation. More investors will come in and so forth. It's very economic basics. And so if we want to do that, actually what we need is positive incentives as well as the reduction bit. So the reduction bit is important, but actually having a bill that's packed full of positive incentives that will also create jobs and new markets, as I say, I think is absolutely critical. That's the bit that you lose if you don't do that.
And we had you, sir, and then behind you. Yeah. Wait for the mic, please, so we can, because we're recording this.
Sure,
so.
sure. My name is Jeff Norman. I'm a member of the Sierra Club. And in the U.S., a lot of power is devolved to state and local governments and to the private sector. And some of them are taking significant actions, say like the state of California, for example. Do you think that it is possible that some of the lack of action on the part of the U.S. federal government could be made up by state and local governments and the private sector?
Well, I guess I'll just take that one, but yeah, I mean, I think that's what we're going to rely on if we don't have federal legislation. We'll rely on the EPA regulation through the EPA. We'll rely on state action, and I think we have three growing regional greenhouse gas initiatives in the United States. One, I think, well along the regional greenhouse gas initiative in the Northeast. We have a very big one in the works in the West, the Western Climate Initiative, which includes several Canadian provinces and Mexican states as observers at this point. All of those are kind of they're all in peril as well by politics. So what happens if there's a referendum in the next ballot in California to overturn AB 32, the comprehensive climate energy legislation passed in the California Assembly? What happens if that goes away? What happens if we get a Republican governor? The winner of the Republican primary in California has said that she would pull out of the Western Climate Initiative if elected. What happens if we get a Republican governor in Massachusetts who's expressed skepticism about climate change itself? All of these things are going to be subject to their own internal political vagaries in the same way that the federal legislation is currently. And so that is a kind of a concern. But absolutely, the short answer is we'd have to build out from those and hopefully get a cooperative environmental protection agency to help those states do better, rather than what we had before was an adversarial environmental protection agency which was not helping them create these programs.
Just wondering if the conclusion from the discussion here should be one of complete despair. If we look at every aspect of this, we're looking at something that might be close to zero in offering us opportunity. The political world here is negative. Right now, our science community doesn't have the means to communicate well with the public. The politicians are doing a very good job, and we're going nowhere fast. It's a negative direction. If we look at the future, where in Bali it was finance and technology transfer will be the answer, our financial means, we're finding, is going down, down, down in many ways, because our debt obligations are going up, up, up federally and at the state level. If we look at China and India, we see growing economies where even with the tremendous leaps that are being made, I think in China, in renewables, it can only go so far because of the growing economy that needs to be sustained, and the fact that our technologies now are not an answer to climate change, because we have extremely high capital cost in wind, in solar. If you look at how many megawatts you get from thousands, millions of dollars, it's not a lot. If we look at nuclear as a possibility, and there's so much nuclear going on in so many countries, India and China and elsewhere, the cost in the US right now is a minimum of $8 billion for one reasonably sized plant. Where are we going if we look at...
Well, that's a very good statement. So if you've got a question, I mean, I think I can get people to respond to that. We kind of know where you're going. Thank you. Very well put. So we talked about this a lot last night at dinner. The sort of was the hope deficit or the hope budget. We overspent our hope budget. But any reactions about this? I have to the question of. Are you
I wouldn't say that it's a total despair. I think around the world there is certainly enough commitment and kind of purpose to see to it that we have concrete action emerging. And the fact that we have this political agreement, which so far stands. Actually, it has not come into question so far, and a guardrail has been established in the form of a 2 degrees centigrade. Actually, gives a kind of a framework in which to act on, and given the fact that the focus has crystallized on finance and technology, also means that we know which are the areas in which to act. Now, the critical question to address this despair, this growing despair, or this emerging despair from whatever side you see, is to actually have demonstrated action happening. The time for words, the time for debate or discourse, and the time for playing out with numbers, that is far over. So even if we come out with very concrete details, as we said, the bilateral actions that are important, the kind of the cooperation that leads to concrete action on the ground, I think they can lead to a groundswell of opinion, a groundswell of civil society pressure on politicians to act with more purpose, with more determinacy, if I can use that word. So I wouldn't say that we should be overwhelmed by despair at this stage. Rather, it should kind of it should be a stage in which we look at each other's strengths, and we look at the international community as a whole in trying to find out what are the key areas of cooperation in which you have specific concrete actions happening in the ground to meet concrete challenges, so that you have that acceptability building up not only in the United States but also in all parts of the world. That kind of a civil society acceptability happening, leading to a momentum, putting pressure on the political leadership to act more definitively.
Maria, you want to say something about that? Because I was in South Africa last summer, and just seeing the amazing excitement on the ground at the community level to get engaged in this, and then see that followed up unexpectedly, though maybe I should have not found it unexpected. The leadership that President Zuma showed in Copenhagen to get this political agreement together was really inspiring.
And I think what we're seeing now is we're not seeing anymore the top-down approach, we're seeing the down-top approach. And I think what we're seeing in the South African context is the private sector is going on. We're doing carbon disclosure project, we're doing carbon management on the supply chain, we're having an entire global supply chain management around our wine industry, our fruit and veg industry. So it's almost happening beside what happened at the global level. And that actually makes me much more optimistic. Because as you mentioned, suddenly the pressure is going to come from different angles than just a global level issue. And so just looking at also on-the-ground project and creativity of people, because now they get the awareness about climate change, and seeing engineers starting looking by themselves at, well, we can build that other way and it's much more energy efficient. And they do it. They are not imposed to do it. They just do it because they want to do it. I think there is still some hope. And I think from a private sector and a supply chain management, you're going to see much more action on the ground and much more cooperation, which is very important in our case anyway.
Quickly, Professor Pan and energy.
Well, yeah, very simply.
A very critical point.
I'm very optimistic. Even in the United States, the federal and local governments are taking actions. The private sector is taking actions, and in China, of course, you have noticed already, because the change will be non-linear. Once we have started, and then we will accelerate the process. In my experience, when I was young, we didn't have enough to eat. I could not imagine at that time we could come to the United States. And now, probably in my lifetime, we might have a chance to see a zero carbon economy.
And I would be very, very careful about negativity and calling the development of the clean energy economy wrongly. The history of technological innovation is littered with hilarious now in the modern, when we know what we know, or when we know what we come to know. Examples, one of my favorite, which is a small one, and by no means at the same scale as this, but interesting, is a very well-known consultancy firm who are pretty big in this climate space, actually, on the strength of some consultancy that work they did for AT&T, in the mid-'80s, advised AT&T not to go down the route of wireless technology because they said the market in the US would be only around about 1 million. Now, and I think as a result of that, AT&T actually lost quite a lot of market advantage. So, it's a small example, but, look at what was said about the telephone when it was first invented, about that this happens time and time again, we repeat this. So while this is much bigger, it's a very, very big challenge. It affects lots of aspects of our life, not just one simple one. Let's not underestimate what we're able to do. And let's not transplant urgency for impatience. So urgency is very important, but let's not be impatient, because it is going to take us a while to get to grips with how to deal with it. But when we do that, I think it'll take off. And let's not underestimate what can be possible.
Okay. Let's collect a few questions. And one here on the side, and then a couple in the back there. Yeah. And then another one here on the left. Yeah. So try to get the last remaining together, just one after another. Short questions, please, and then we'll get some final answers from the panel.
Hi. Jesse Peterson from the Bank Information Center. I was curious to know if I may ask the panel for each country's positions, perhaps, on the role of international financial institutions and in creating perhaps the global architecture, financial architecture for climate mitigation initiatives. And
thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Great, Jesse, thank you. And then in the back there, couple.
Following up on that one and the comment from our British colleague up there, Bill Hersey from American University. In 1942, Enrico Fermi did the first chain reaction. 3 years later, we had nuclear weapons that were effective. I asked a high-ranking official in DOE in the last administration, what's keeping the U.S. from putting on a Manhattan Project type of operation to switch to solar and wind power? And he said, only political will. The elephant in the room is the domination of our government by the captains of the fossil fuel industry. Look at EPA approving mountaintop rip-offs of hydraulic fracturing to bring up more gas. I heard in this very room about the wonders of switching to gas as a transitional energy. But if the U.S. doesn't have enough political will and enough capital at the moment to put together a Manhattan Project to switch to solar and wind, what about the international community? Is there will and money in the international community to put together a Manhattan Project type of operation? We've got enough energy coming down from the sun to supply all the energy the U.S. would need in 100 square miles of the desert. All we need to do is switch it's not just all we need to do, it's a big job, but we've got a grid issue to deal with, but it's just hard. Well, let's get on with it. We can do it. That's what Obama promised. Yes, we can. Well, let's get on with it.
And behind you there?
Hi, my name is Niraj. I'm from the State Department. So the common motif today has been the U.S. needs to take leadership. And from the way I see things in the political environment here, any climate change bill is going to be tied to significant jobs, some way to protect or create jobs in the states, especially after this November. Given that, and if our goal is to all work together to reduce or to mitigate the effects of climate change, and President Obama's new initiative to rebalance the economy to drive export-driven growth in the U.S., what are countries like China and India doing to provide a more competitive environment for American companies to provide climate change, green-friendly technologies in those countries, China and India?
Great. And then we have one more here on the side. And then we'll do, everyone pick what you'd like to respond to. We'll start with Andrew. Come around.
Hi, I'm Ken Vincent from EIA. Most of the scenario analysis of domestic climate change legislation shows that the most economically palatable scenarios involve a high level of international offsets. My question is there concern that if climate legislation passes in the States and there's this rush on carbon markets in other parts of the world, is that going to drive up the price of carbon in other parts of the world and sort of snatch up a lot of the low-hanging fruit, or low-hanging carbon, I guess, that would make it sort of more difficult to achieve domestic goals in other markets?
Great. Okay, thanks. So, Andrew.
Well, look, first of all, the idea of driving up the carbon price is probably quite a good one, I would have thought, really, because that's the policy. The big problem we've had with the ETS in Europe is the price. It's worked brilliantly as a carbon market, but actually the carbon price isn't enough to sustain policy goals at the moment. So actually having a greater demand for carbon credits is going to be, I think, really important going forward, and it is the game. That's the name of the game. So that's not a bad thing. I'll finish off and very, very briefly by reiterating this point about economic competitiveness, because I'm sitting in the home of economic free enterprise, of competitive free enterprise. If the US can't work out a way to do this through the free competitive marketplace, then nobody can. So that really is, I think, the challenge.
Well, the home is the American Enterprise Institute. That's across town.
But the challenge, thank you. The challenge for you, I'll pop over there later. The challenge for you guys is the challenge for you guys, and really, I guess for us as Brits as well, because we've championed the free market ideology. And yes, governments do need to intervene, but I think they need to intervene to stimulate, to drive free enterprise in the right direction. So this isn't about picking winners, and it's not about being heavy-handed and you know, a return to the 1970s as we would see it in the UK. It's about a stealthy state that's able to understand the direction of the global market in the future and help orientate its economy in that direction. Because otherwise, I think jobs will be lost rather than gained. And rebalancing the global economy, as maybe Professor Pan would also agree, is something that needs to happen. It's in China's interests as well as in the US's interests. China has a huge domestic market that it needs to develop. It's in its interest to do that. These things don't happen overnight, but actually there's a shared interest. Rebalancing the economy and rebalancing it around the creation of jobs in the US in low-carbon industries, I think would be an extraordinary win-win.
Arabinda?
Well, I'll take that question on, giving opportunities or providing opportunities on clean energy in the Indian markets to companies from United States. I think the way the policies have developed, there is certainly an openness to have FDIs coming into this particular sector to promote actually partnerships, corporate partnerships, and in creating capacity in the solar and wind sector, particularly in the solar sector. Particularly when we look at the targets that have been set in the National Solar Mission, 20,000 megawatt in 10 years' time. That is something which the policy-making community in India recognizes that would require significant partnerships with the private sector, with the foreign private sector, and the kind of fiscal incentives that has been that are being talked about and that are already there in the mission document. They certainly promote that kind of an international collaboration. So, and the overall economic environment, in the last decade has been towards more openness, more receptive to FDI, less of a what you would say the kind of a license Raj that we had earlier to promote Indian companies alone. I think the situation today in the Indian economy is drastically different when it comes to promoting foreign investment. So that's why I would say the opportunities are huge for international collaboration. And the other question on the international financial mechanism and the role of international financial institutions. I think the stated position as far as India goes, the official position is to any kind of a governance mechanism that we should be considering has to be under the UN framework, of Convention on Climate Change. It has to be democratic, it has to be transparent, and it has to give that kind of a participation, that kind of a opportunity for participation of all countries in the decision-making process when it comes to deciding on allocation of financial resources. And to the extent it comes to execution, the execution part, the implementation part, I think that's where the international financial institutions can play a role. But the governance part of it would still, at least we would still like to see it under the UN framework, controlled by the, or governed by the Conference of Parties in a very democratic and transparent manner.
Well, higher carbon price is not a bad thing. That would help a faster move to a lower and zero carbon economy. That means that if you have higher carbon productivity, and then you would be more competitive. So I think that competitivity is carbon productivity, and the China is aware of such a challenge, not only because of energy security, but also for carbon productivity as well. So I think that this is something probably the world has to compete, not on the conventional means, but for carbon productivity, and for faster transformation to a zero carbon economy. The multinational banks, these financial institutions, have to play a role, and there's no doubt about it.
I just would like to add on the financial institution, international one and private one. I think what we're realizing is the traditional approach is not always working for renewable energy project or energy efficiency project. So we have engaged with them in terms of kind of, first of all, rationalizing the approach in Africa or in developing country, and have a more, I will say, cohesive approach in between themselves. And second of all, to start creating new financial instruments that work especially at the feasibility and seed funding approach. That's been a huge issue around renewable energy project. And also from the private institution perspective, the bank need to start rethinking the level of their involvement, meaning when they make the decision that they want to get and invest in a renewable energy project, especially again in Africa, our projects are not always that big, so the return are not always that great, and banks find it difficult to justify the risk approach and justify the investment decision. So I think there is a need for innovation in that specific aspect for smaller scale projects, let's put it that way, which are important in developing countries.
So we've gone 5 minutes over, but just so that our friend's question from American University is not orphaned in this. I don't know what the prospects are for a Manhattan style project in clean energy in other countries without the U.S. taking the lead. I do know that we have lots of good examples of where other countries are certainly cooperating and taking the lead on this. Australia, one of our partners is the Climate Institute in Australia, but Australia has provided the principal funding and also brought in a bunch of international collaborators for an institute in Canberra, which is going to be a research center on carbon capture and sequestration, already doing very ambitious work. As I said earlier in the week, Secretary Chu brought together the energy ministers from the 17 largest economies in the world, where they've rolled out these small, certainly smaller scale, nothing like a Manhattan project, but very concrete targets for cooperation with respect to regional development on clean energy, and we'll sort of see how that process continues. This first meeting was in Washington. The next one will be in 2011 in Abu Dhabi, followed by another one in the fall in England. And I think I guess would just sort of leave you with this. What if it was the case, right, that a consortium of other countries said, all right, forget it. We're not going to wait anymore on the U.S. dragging its heels. They've got this great institutions of higher education like your own, like many of the institutions we have in this country. We've got these great research centers. We've got the venture capital out there to sort of motivate these things, but we haven't been able to put together the pieces, and we just seem unwilling to do so. So a big consortium did it outside and sort of created, the kind of the energy solutions which really are going to get us there and get all the co-benefits in terms of lowered pollution and everything else that sort of goes along with the clean energy solutions. If the U.S. is not still dragging its feet while the rest of the world was doing something like that, there would be very, very little to motivate them to share the fruits of their labors with us. And that kind of story is essentially kind of what's happening right now and why the U.S. really needs to move forward to join the rest of the world on climate action. So thank you all very much for coming, and please thank our panelists for their coming such a long way.